Okay, welcome to another Jog Pod with Mr. Knight and Mr. Hatchell. Today we're going to start looking through the first sort of page on sustaining ecosystems, which is topic 4. Okay, we're going to try and keep this one super quick. There's some really key things you need to get from this first page, but we'll try and give you some nice detail as well. So just to kick us off with what is an ecosystem and ecosystems components, we'll go over to Mr. Hatchell. Off we go, sir. What's an ecosystem?
So an ecosystem is basically a community of living organisms, okay? So it's a community of plants and animals that interact in a certain environment. And in those ecosystems, we have basically two types of components. They are either abiotic or biotic. Now, abiotic is non-living elements, and they are things like air and water and heat. Whereas biotic elements are living elements. So they are things such as plants and animals. For plants and animals, we also have the scientific and geographical terms for those. So remember, flora is plants. Think of the butter. It comes from plants.
Whereas that's how I remember, always the butter, always flora, butter, like it.
Always the butter. Whereas fauna is about animal life. So flora are for plants and fauna are for animals. And within ecosystems, we get what are called food chains and food webs. Now, a food chain is just one chain, okay? So it's just one stream of plants and then animals. And the animals are the consumers. So we have the primary consumers and the secondary consumers. And they eat one by one as you go up the chain. And they get their energy as you go up the chain. However, with food webs, it's kind of a mixture of lots of food chains put together. So you may have lots of different animals relying on different plants and relying on other animals for energy and food. And sometimes then if you remove one thing from a food chain or a food web, what happens is either the plants or the animals in that food chain or web have to adapt and eat something else, or over time you get species dying out and species becoming extinct. Mr. Knight, does that make sense so far?
Yeah, that does. Really good. Just one thing, sir. Sometimes I see plants get called producers. So where do they get their energy from if they're called producers? How do they get that?
So the reason they're called producers is because they produce food. They get their energy from photosynthesis, the sun. And that's how they, if you think about plant leaf, that's how it grows over time. The stomata on the leaf, if you're good with science, the stomata on the leaf takes in the energy from its solar radiation, the sun. It grows and then it produces food for the consumers afterwards.
Excellent, sir. I love that. So moving on from our food chains, food webs, and the basics, we're going to start thinking about the nutrient cycle. We do think about the nutrient cycle within the rainforest as well, so that'll sort of link in a little bit later. But essentially, there's 3 key things that you're going to try and think about that are going to matter in the nutrient cycle. And if you can see in the little diagram, if you're able to, sir, just zoom in on that little diagram, the biomass and litter at all. So we're going to break down some key terms here. Okay, so biomass is any living thing. Okay, and really what we're interested in, obviously, like the word mass means sort of the amount of, or how much living stuff is there within that particular ecosystem. So in the rainforest, we've got lots of biomass, okay? And within that, as Mr. Hatcher was talking about, there's obviously energy and there's nutrients within those living things. So what we were interested in was what happens to those nutrients within the cycle? How do they move between the different elements within it? And effectively, there are 3 key elements, which is the biomass itself, litter, and soil. Okay, so if I've suddenly got some plants or some animals and they're my biomass, but then they either die or the plants fall to the floor, that's a process that we call littering. So much like, you might have litter on the floor in terms of crisp packets and stuff like that, the natural leaves and the decaying matter on the rainforest floor is litter. Okay, and obviously over time that will decompose. Okay, as it decomposes, obviously those nutrients that are within those biomass, what were living things, will pass down into the soil. Okay, and again, that gives a chance for it to be recycled, because once it's in the soil, plants can uptake it through their roots and it will create new living things. If we go back to Mr. Hatchell's food chain, Obviously, the plants then collect them through their roots, and then a herbivore will come along and eat them there. Okay, so that's the basic principle of the nutrient cycle. There's a couple of other things within there that you might want to watch out for. Okay, so obviously rainfall in the rainforest is quite significant, so it can wash away some of that litter from the soil in what we call surface runoff, and it can wash that way into rivers and things like that and away from the soil. The other word that you can see there that we've maybe not mentioned as much is a process called leaching. Okay, and leaching is essentially where nutrients are washed away out from the soil into sort of rivers or water areas of water and stuff like that. We talk about it in particular later on when we look at deforestation and how the removal of trees and their roots can mean that more soil can be washed away because it's not protected by the tree. But effectively, that's the nutrient cycle: biomass, litter, and soil, and how the nutrients move around between them. Obviously, we're looking at rainforests, but there is not just a rainforest as a biome. There are multiple. Mr. Hatchell, talk to me about some biomes, please.
Mr. Unite, just before we move on, is the nutrient cycle kind of the reason why only the top layer of soil in a rainforest is nutritious, is fertile?
Yeah, indeed. Love that. So, yeah. So, in other places, we might expect there to be more sort of soil deeper down that has lots of nutrients in. But obviously, in the rainforest, everything's competing to grow as fast as it can. So we find very thin nutrient soils in the rainforest because essentially everything's within the biomass. Okay, so everything's living. It's not really sitting in the soil because everything's desperate to get those nutrients to grow big and strong. So yeah, very thin soil. And like I said, when we talk about deforestation and leaching, that is also going to come up again there. So yeah, great question to bring that up there, sir. Well done.
Thank you, Mr. Unite. So with biomes then, and you've got a map of those biomes on the bottom left of your screen here. Essentially, in your GCSE exam, you will not be asked to remember where all of these biomes are. What you need is just an overarching broad knowledge of why the biomes are where they are. Now, if we have a look at this map, and you've got the color coding on the right hand side here for where the biomes are. Essentially, the most important thing to remember is the actual climate, the long-term weather of a region determines what biome exists there. So the reason, for example, we have tropical grasslands and tropical rainforests and hot deserts in effectively the middle of the map mainly, is because the equator is there. We know that that area gets the most solar radiation, and we know that that area is the warmest. Whereas if we go very north, and if we have a look at the tundra regions and the polar regions, the reason that they are there is because the climate of those areas is very cold. And that's what dictates those biomes being there. And therefore, that also then dictates what types of plants and animals you will find in these places. So the really important thing to remember, as I said, is the climate is the reason for these biomes existing in these parts of the world. Notably, the UK, for example, is deciduous forest. So that's why we have a lot of green forest all year round. Also notably, if you think about Australia, for example, Australia is well known for its central parts being very hot and dry. They are desert, okay? Also referred to as the outback. Whereas the coastal areas, because they receive more rainfall, actually some of them are tropical in the north and some of them are also deciduous like in the UK. So that is just a quick overview of where the biomes are and why they are there. Mr. Unite, does that make sense?
Yeah, that does, sir. And it always the way I always remind people about Australia is we talk about I'm a Celebrity, and they go, "Oh yeah, I thought Australia was just desert," and then they remember that there's I'm a Celebrity as well. So, right, okay, some rainforest spaces for you. Okay, so obviously Mr. Hatch was talking to you about the biomes. He's already sort of roughly alluded to where our rainforests are, but in terms of that left-hand side image, okay, obviously you can see along the equator we find our sort of bands of tropical rainforests. So they're found obviously between the tropics, which is why they're called that, but they're actually on the equator. The reason for that, okay, we won't go into massive amounts of details because it overlaps with some other bits as well, but essentially, obviously being at the equator, they're getting the full whack and concentration of the sun, so they want to be warm. But we have what's called a low pressure zone between where two Hadley cells meet. So in terms of where you've done in your global hazards unit, and you talk about the global circulation system, that's a nice overlap there. So a chance for you to do some cross-reference in there and to maybe look back at that if you're not 100% sure. But in a nutshell, it's going to be warm because it's close to the equator, and there's low pressure, which importantly allows air to rise within here. Okay, so that means we're going to get moisture in the atmosphere, creating cloud, which means we're going to find that around the equator. Okay, and obviously some well-known rainforests, obviously the Amazon in South America, of which obviously a significant amount is in Brazil, which is ones that we looked at. Some two other key things that you might want to think about is obviously the nutrient cycle. Obviously, Mr. Hatchell quizzed me on this earlier, which is absolutely correct. Okay, so obviously we've talked about how in the rainforest most of the nutrients are within the biomass. So the soil has very little. Okay, and this just goes into this in a bit more detail because obviously it's hot and damp. Just like I imagine if you left something out in a hot, damp condition, you'd imagine it get pretty smelly pretty quickly. It's the same principle, okay, obviously, but things will decay and decompose much faster in the rainforest than they would, in the UK, for example, okay? Therefore, we're going to find those nutrients getting into the soil, and it's going to get uptaken. Uptaken, is that the right word? Uptaken, sir?
Or infiltrated into, yeah.
Yeah, infiltrated, yeah, there we go. Yeah, I like that. Yeah, infiltrated into the plants themselves via their roots, okay? That means that they're not really in the soil for very, very long, okay? And as it says in that final sentence there, if vegetation is removed, okay, so through deforestation, soils can quickly become infertile. And so if you just quickly go back to the bottom left-hand corner where we looked at the nutrient cycle, we can just see that recapped again, okay? So just over here, we can see the word leaching. Okay, and that's that process whereby, because we don't have the roots holding the soil together, as that rain falls, it can help to wash away that mud with the soils in them as well, and that will be our loss of nutrients there. One final key thing, okay, we talked a bit about climate a little bit, but obviously the main important thing is they've got pretty steady temperature. They're on the equator, so they're always going to be reasonably warm, but they don't get as hot as places like the hot deserts. Okay, and the key reason for this, we're going to go into more detail in a second to talk about convectional rainfall, but it's essentially that low pressure which allows that cloud to get into the atmosphere, which helps to insulate it. As well as this, okay, it just means that we have convectional rainfall that goes on. Okay, so essentially we've got, as you can see on the right-hand side of the climate graph, high levels of rainfall throughout the year, but it does vary. Okay, that's the key thing to remember. It does vary in rainfall, but it is always high. But temperature, as you can nice clearly see by the line graph, okay, is the temperature stays relatively constant. Thank you, Mr. Hatchell, for making that nice and clear. Excellent. So essentially, convectional rainfall, we've seen that term a few times before. Global hazards and convection currents is one. And we're effectively about that heating and cooling. So if I think about the rainforest in the morning, okay, I know that it's going to get heated up by the sun throughout the day. Okay, so as it heats up, it's going to sort of transpire. Air is going to sort of moisture is going to evaporate into the atmosphere. As it evaporates into that atmosphere, it will eventually cool and condense and form clouds. Well, naturally, obviously, that happens constantly throughout the day because it's super hot in the rainforest. So it's going to happen a lot. It's going to happen on a daily basis. So what happens once it's in the atmosphere is it creates, obviously, lots of rainfall, in particular in the afternoon in the rainforest. It's almost like clockwork. Some great documentaries out there where you can have a look at that, and it really talks you like the rainfall being on time perfectly. And what that means is then the rainfall will cool down and come down and sort of be what we call intercepted. So like in football, if you pass the ball and someone gets in the way, they intercept it. The trees intercept the rain either by gathering it on their leaves or by getting into the soil and it being uptaken or infiltrating into the roots of the plants. Okay, and that cycle continues, and therefore, each day they have what's called convectional rainfall as a particular key thing. Right, sir, thought I'd smash through that as reasonably as quickly as you can. Anything to add to that? I feel like I was pretty quick. Otherwise, carry on.
No, that was brilliant. I'm going to actually move on just to mention one little thing that we didn't mention earlier, but it's really related, and that is this little section here called interdependence in the rainforest. So this relates really back to where we discussed food chains and food webs. The idea is that all communities of plants and animals, in other words, tropical rainforests, for example, are interdependent. And what that word essentially means is plants and animals depend on each other for survival. So remember I said earlier, for example, Mr. Unite, that you may have in a food chain a plant and then an animal and another animal and another animal as producers and consumers. And if you remove one of those, either the producer or one of the consumers, what happens is the food chain or food web has to change. They are very, very much dependent upon each other, and that also can be for survival. So there has to be some change if there is a loss of some part of the ecosystem. So that's basically what the term interdependent means. Does that make sense, sir?
Yeah, no, nice and simple like that. Good, nice little link back to the food chains and food webs as well.
Brilliant. Right, so the layers of the rainforest. This one's really simple, so I'm going to make this really quick. This is just to illustrate what heights the trees of the rainforests get to. Okay, so what we've got on this right-hand side of the screen is an image to show you the 4 layers. And essentially, those 4 layers are emergent, canopy, under canopy, and shrub or forest floor. Now, the emergent trees, if we have a look at our image on the right, are the trees that stick out from everything else. They're the tallest trees. Not all of them get to this height, and they can reach up to 50 meters in some rainforests. Underneath the emergent layer, we've got the canopy. Now, this is the main layer where most of the trees grow to, okay? And here, the trees receive about 70% of the sunlight and 80% of total light. So these receive most of the light from the sky, from solar radiation, and that allows them to grow to this height. However, in the under canopy, which is just under here where it says understory, just under the main canopy layer, we have trees that get up to about 20 meters high. They receive less than 50% of the light, the total light that is, and therefore they don't grow as tall. There's less light going into the stomata of the leaves. There's less photosynthesis taking place, and therefore they don't grow as tall. And finally, shrub layer. And these are exactly what it says. These are the lowest layer, the small trees, the shrubs on the bottom of the forest floor, and they've adapted to live in the shade. Any questions, sir?
No, super quick, sir. Like it.
Brilliant. Related to that and what we spoke about earlier as well, the main soil profile that we find, the main types of soil we find in a tropical rainforest are called latisols. Okay, and these types of soil are not very fertile. And what that means is they don't easily grow lots of different types of species of plants. Now, you might be thinking, hold on a minute, we know that tropical rainforests grow loads of trees. Yes, they do. However, those trees have adapted really well to be able to grow in the rainforest floor. So, for example, buttress roots, which is not on here, but buttress roots are roots that actually grow horizontally on the rainforest floor. And they've grown horizontally because, as we said earlier, the nutrient cycle creates what's called a humus layer, and that humus layer is very fertile. And therefore, these trees grow on this very, very top, like leaf litter section, whereby there is enough nutrients to grow those trees. We've also underneath there got the topsoil and the subsoil and the rock. And essentially what happens is the deeper you go in a rainforest profile of soils, the latisols, the less fertile the soil becomes. Mr. Unite, have you got anything to add to that?
No, I really like that, sir. The only thing I like from there, it says about where it's normally red, and I've definitely seen my kids asked before when we've seen deforestation, like, oh, why is the soil red? So it's nice for that to come up there. Okay, no, otherwise really good. Really like that summary, sir. Nice and quick.
Brilliant. Right, the last thing then is, this is kind of an expansion on what we looked at a few minutes ago. So this has the main biomes of the world, along with where they are, what temperature they are on average, what types of rainfall they get, what types of plants we see in the area, and what types of animals we see. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but I am going to pick out 2 that are quite important to us. So obviously, tropical rainforests. We know from Mr. Unite's explanation earlier that they are centered across the equator, the Tropic of Cancer and Capricorn. We know that their temperature goes up to about 30 degrees Celsius, and it's pretty constant throughout the year. We know that the rainfall is very high throughout the year, and it's generally over 2,000 millimeters per year. That says 200. It actually should be 2,000. We know that the types of plants we see are mainly tall trees, and they form a canopy, but we've also got the, as we go back up here, we've also got the emergent layer, okay, and the understory or the under canopy and the shrub layer. So we've got lots of different trees at different heights. And finally, for tropical rainforest then, Tropical rainforests have one great fact about them, and that is this, that they have the greatest range of different animal species of any biome in the world. They have around 70% of all of the world's animal species in them. So they're extremely important for biodiversity and having different types of plants and animals. And they're also a great habitat for these animals. They've managed to adapt really well to live here. So that is tropical rainforests, and I'm just going to do one more, and that will be our temperate forest. So that's the UK, for example. Okay. Now, these are between 40 and 60 degrees north of the equator on the lines of latitude, so exactly where the UK is situated. If you think back to when we did, as Sir mentioned earlier, when we did the global circulation system in global hazards, in weather particularly, we said that the feral cell is located around 40 to 60 degrees north and south of the equator. So that's where we're talking about. Now, what we get in the UK is warm summers and mild winters. We don't usually get temperatures for under 0 degrees Celsius in winter for a long period of time. Okay, so they dip under it, but they don't stay under it for very long. We have variable rainfall depending on where you are. So it can be as low as 500 millimeters per year, but it can be 1,500 millimeters or even 2,000 millimeters in the UK a year as well. We mainly get green trees all year round in the UK, although obviously some plant species you have in your back garden might die every year. And we have a variety of those types of plants. And our main types of animals actually are able to adapt to the colder and warmer climates every year. So our main types of animals, for example, what they'll do is either they will stay in the same place all year round and adapt really well, or they will migrate like birds do and move to warmer climates during winter and vice versa. You can have a little read through the other biomes that are there on screen for you. And all you need to do is have a very, very brief or broad awareness of what those biomes are like. Mr. Unai, I'll leave it to you to finish.
Yeah, no, like that, sir. Obviously, we look at the tundra a little bit when we do sort of the other side, don't we, as well? So that's definitely one they can have a little look at as well. But, you know, that deciduous one, I always got taught, what do they decide to do? Well, they decide to lose their leaves. And that's another little Mr. Unite silly analogy for you there, sir. But no, otherwise, a nice quick overview of the sort of the key basics of sustaining ecosystems there for you. Okay, so don't forget there's a second page where we look at some of the case studies and things like that in terms of ICE Hotel. And we also go back through and we look at some of the other sections as well. So keep your eye out for the next jog pod, which looks at the other side. But otherwise, thank you very much from me, and thank you very much to Mr. Hatchell for your contributions today. What you got to say, sir? Sign off.
Thank you.
Love it. Thank you very much for tuning in.